The wagon creaked into Willow Springs on a humid Tuesday morning in late September 1887. Dust billowing from wheels that had traversed 200 miles of unforgiving frontier. Margaret Hayes sat rigid on the driver's bench, her spine straight, despite the trembling in her hands as she gripped the leather reins. Wrapped in a threadbare blue shawl beside her, sat her daughter Rose, barely 5 years old, with chestnut curls escaping from beneath her cotton bonnet and eyes wide with wonder. If you're enjoying this tale of second chances and unexpected reunions, share it with someone who believes in the power of love to heal old wounds. Sometimes the past we run from is exactly what we need to embrace. Willow Springs was modest, perhaps 300 souls if you counted the ranchers who ventured into town on Saturdays. Main Street stretched 4 dusty blocks, lined with weathered clapboard storefronts. Mountains ringed the valley to the west, their peaks still crowned with snow, even as autumn painted the cottonwoods gold. Margaret guided the wagon past the blacksmith's forge, past the barber shop where men lounged outside smoking, past the hotel where a woman in an emerald dress paused to stare. A solitary woman traveling alone with a child drew attention like honey drew bears. She pulled the wagon to a halt outside a small cottage at the eastern edge of town, separated by a quarter-mile of scrubland from the other houses. The cottage was plain, constructed of weathered pine with a shallow porch and a stone chimney. The windows needed washing, the porch rail sagged, but the roof appeared sound and the door had a lock. $12 a month was precisely all Margaret could afford. "Is this our home, Mama?" Rose asked, her voice small and uncertain. Margaret lifted her daughter to the dusty ground and smoothed her tangled hair. "Yes, sweetheart, this is home now." By sunset, Margaret had unloaded their meager belongings into the cottage's 3 cramped rooms. She cooked beans and cornbread over the temperamental stove, then tucked Rose into bed. "Will we stay here forever?" the child asked, her brown eyes solemn. "For a good long while," Margaret said carefully, kissing her forehead. "Now close your eyes and dream of beautiful things." But after Rose fell asleep, Margaret stood at the kitchen window staring out at the darkening land, wrapping her arms around herself against a sudden chill. She had come to Willow Springs to start over, to escape the whispers in her hometown, to give Rose a life untainted by shame. She had chosen this remote town because no one knew her here. No one knew her story, or so she had desperately believed. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the kitchen window. Margaret woke early and stepped outside to fetch water from the well 20 yards behind the cottage. As she cranked the windlass and drew up the bucket, a movement caught her eye. She turned her head and saw him standing there like an apparition from her past. A man stood in the yard of the neighboring property, perhaps 50 yards away. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, a dusty shirt rolled to the elbows, and worn denim trousers. He held a coil of rope in one hand and an axe in the other. He had frozen mid-step, staring at her as though he'd seen a ghost. Margaret's heart stopped, then stuttered back to life with painful force. Thomas Bennett. She knew him instantly, though 6 long years had passed since she'd last seen him. He was taller than she remembered, broader through the shoulders, his face bronzed by the sun. But the shape of his jaw, the set of his mouth, the way he stood with his weight on one hip, those hadn't changed at all. For a moment that stretched like eternity, neither of them moved. Then Thomas dropped the rope and took a step toward her. Margaret turned on her heel, sloshing water over the rim of the bucket, and hurried back inside. She slammed the door and threw the bolt, her pulse hammering in her ears. Of all the places she could have rented, of all the towns she could have chosen, and here he was, living right next door. By mid-morning, the knock came. Margaret opened the door just a crack. Thomas stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncertain. "Margaret," he said quietly, her name a prayer on his lips. She tightened her grip on the door. "Mr. Bennett." He flinched at the formality. "I didn't know you were here. If you need anything, wood, repairs, I'm happy to help." "We don't need anything," Margaret said crisply. "Good day." She closed the door before he could say another word. Thomas didn't give up easily. The next morning, Margaret found a stack of kindling on her porch, neatly split and tied with twine. The morning after, there was more. On the 3rd day, he knocked again, offering to fix a loose shingle on the roof. She refused, but the next day found the shingle already repaired. She stared at the neat patch of new wood and felt something twist in her chest, anger and gratitude all tangled together. The town's curiosity grew sharper. At church on Sunday, Margaret felt eyes on her throughout the service, heard whispers trailing behind her. Outside, a stout woman named Patricia Donovan stepped forward. "Your daughter is precious. She must favor her father." Margaret's stomach clenched. "She favors my mother." She took Rose's hand and walked away, her cheeks burning. One evening, Rose slipped out the back door and wandered toward Thomas's property. Margaret found her daughter in his yard while he taught her to swing a lasso. "Rose!" Margaret's voice cracked like a whip. She grabbed her daughter's hand and pulled her away. "Stay away from her," she told Thomas, her eyes blazing. "Stay away from both of us." Thomas came to the door an hour later. "Margaret, I know I hurt you. I know I left without a word, but I didn't want to. My family sent me away. They didn't tell me you'd been looking for me. They didn't give me your letters." She stared at him, her throat tight. "Letters? You wrote to me. 4 letters. I found them last year in my father's desk after he died. He'd kept them hidden all these years." Thomas's voice broke. "I didn't abandon you by choice. I was 20 years old and they threatened to cut me off if I didn't go to Montana. I thought you'd forgotten me." Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "And now here we are." "Yes," he said softly. They stood in heavy silence. Finally, Margaret spoke. "It doesn't change anything, Thomas. You left, I survived, and I don't need you now." "Maybe not," he said, his gaze steady. "But she might. Rose looks like my grandmother. Same eyes, same smile. I've been doing the arithmetic, Margaret." Margaret stepped back, her heart pounding. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" She slammed the door. Are you captivated by Margaret and Thomas's story? Keep reading to discover whether love can truly conquer all. Share this with someone who needs to believe in redemption. Days passed in tense silence. Then Rose fell ill with a high fever. Margaret was desperate, terrified, with no way to reach the doctor 3 miles away. A knock came at the door. Thomas stood there, concern etched in his face. "I saw your lamp burning late. Is everything all right?" Margaret's pride crumbled. "Rose is sick. I need the doctor." Thomas didn't hesitate. "I'll ride for him." He was gone before she could thank him, and Margaret returned to Rose's bedside, praying harder than she'd ever prayed. The doctor arrived an hour later and examined Rose with gentle hands. "It's a fever. Nothing more serious. Keep her cool and give her this twice a day. She'll be fine in a week." Margaret nearly collapsed with relief. When the doctor left, she turned to Thomas. "Thank you," she said quietly, meaning it with every fiber of her being. Over the next week, as Rose recovered, something changed between them. Thomas brought fresh milk and honey. He fixed the loose porch step. When Rose begged her mother to let Thomas visit, Margaret finally agreed. "Fine, he can visit, but only for an hour." That evening, Thomas came to supper. Rose chattered through the whole meal, and afterward he read aloud from her primer. Rose leaned against his shoulder, and Margaret watched from the kitchen, feeling something inside her crack open, something she'd locked away 6 years ago. The visits became routine. Twice a week, Thomas came for supper, bringing small carved gifts and wildflowers. Rose adored him, and Margaret softened, remembering why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. One afternoon in late October, Thomas was in her kitchen after fixing a loose board. "Margaret," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" Her hands stilled in the bread dough. "What?" "Is Rose mine?" The question hung in the air. Margaret's breath caught. "Don't," she whispered. "I need to know. I've done the math. I've seen her face. Tell me the truth, please. It doesn't matter." "It does." His voice was raw. "Margaret, if she's mine, then what?" She spun around, her eyes blazing. "You don't get to waltz back into our lives and demand answers after 6 years." He moved closer. "Please, I need to know." And then, because the walls she'd built were crumbling, because she was so tired of carrying the secret alone, she whispered, "Yes." Thomas exhaled a shuddering breath and closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were bright with tears. "Why didn't you tell me?" "You were gone," her voice broke. "You were gone and I was alone, and I didn't know what else to do." He reached for her, and she didn't pull away. His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away her tear. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Margaret." And then they were kissing. desperate and hungry, 6 years of longing poured into a single moment. His hands tangled in her hair, her fingers gripped his shirt. They stumbled backward, knocking into the table, flour dust rising around them. His lips moved to her neck and she gasped, her hands sliding under his shirt. "Margaret," he breathed. "God, I've missed you." She pulled him closer, heat building between them. And then, just as his hands moved to the buttons of her dress, reality crashed back and she froze. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking. He stopped instantly, pulling back. "What's wrong?" The words spilled out before she could stop them. "Please don't come inside again. I don't want history to repeat itself." Understanding hit Thomas like a physical blow and he stepped back. "You mean Rose?" Margaret's cheeks burned. She turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't do this again. I can't let you in and then watch you leave. I can't risk another child, another abandonment. I'm not gonna leave. You don't know that." "Yes, I can." His voice was fierce. "Margaret, I'm not the boy who left 6 years ago. I'm not going anywhere. I swear it." "That's what you said before." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Then let me prove it. However long it takes, let me prove it." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I can trust you again." "I'll wait," he said softly. "As long as it takes, I'll wait." And then he left, and Margaret sank to the floor and wept. At dawn, Thomas rode to the home of Nora Sullivan, the midwife. She pulled out a leather-bound ledger and showed him the entry. Rose May Hayes, born April 14, 1882. Mother's name Margaret Hayes. Father's name not listed. April 1882, 9 months after he'd been sent away. Thomas retrieved the 4 letters his father had hidden and brought them to Margaret that afternoon. She took them with trembling hands, recognizing her own handwriting. As she read words she'd written 6 years ago, full of love and fear and desperate hope, tears streamed down her face. "He kept these from you," she said, her voice breaking. "All this time, I thought you didn't care." "Never," Thomas said fiercely. "I never stopped thinking about you. My father sent me away and made sure you couldn't reach me, but I tried to come back." "I believe you," she whispered, and those 3 words felt like forgiveness, like the beginning of something new. She stepped into his arms and let him hold her, and they began to heal. Over the following weeks, they rebuilt what had been broken. "I want to marry you," Thomas said one evening. "I want to be Rose's father openly. I want us to be a family." Margaret looked at him, this man who had broken her heart and was now offering to mend it, and she made her choice. She chose hope over fear, love over bitterness. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They married 3 weeks later in the small church, with Rose as their flower girl and half the town in attendance. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the church bell rang out across the valley, announcing new beginnings and second chances. That night, Thomas tucked Rose into bed. "Will you tuck me in, Papa?" she asked, testing out the new word with wonder. Thomas's eyes grew bright with tears. "Of course, sweetheart." Life settled into a new rhythm. Thomas worked his land, building up a cattle herd. Margaret opened a sewing shop on Main Street. Money was tight, but they managed. Rose thrived in school. 2 years later, Margaret gave birth to Benjamin, and 2 years after that, Lily arrived. The cottage grew with additions, and their family flourished. The town's opinion shifted gradually. People saw the way Thomas doted on his children, the way Margaret ran her shop with quiet efficiency. Patricia Donovan, who had once been quick to judge, came to the shop one day. "I need a dress for my daughter's wedding. I heard you're the best seamstress in 3 counties. When Margaret delivered the finished dress, Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect." "Thank you, Margaret." 20 years after Margaret rolled into Willow Springs in a dusty wagon, she stood on the porch of her home and watched the sun set over the mountains. The house had grown, the ranch had prospered, and her shop had expanded. Rose was married now with a child of her own. Benjamin worked the ranch with his father. Lily had become a teacher. Thomas came out onto the porch and wrapped his arms around her. She leaned back against his chest. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "That day in the kitchen," she said, "when I told you not to come inside again." He laughed. "I thought you were going to throw a rolling pin at my head." She turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me? Taking on a child you didn't know about?" "Never," he said fiercely. Rose is mine in every way that matters, and you're the best thing that ever happened to me." She smiled and kissed him, a kiss that held 20 years of love and choosing each other every single day. Inside, they heard their children's voices, laughter and chaos. "Sounds like chaos," Thomas said. "Sounds like home," Margaret corrected. They stayed on the porch as darkness fell, holding each other as stars appeared one by one. Margaret thought about the girl she'd been, frightened and alone, convinced her life was over. She thought about the moment she'd opened her door to find Thomas standing there. She thought about the words that had changed everything. "Please don't come inside again. I don't want history to repeat itself." In a way, history had repeated itself, but not the painful parts. Instead, they'd created a new history together. One written in shared meals and whispered promises, in children's laughter and hard-won trust, in choosing love over fear every single day. Sometimes the past we run from is exactly what we need to embrace. Sometimes the person who broke our heart is the only one who can truly mend it. And sometimes, if we're brave enough to trust again, second chances lead to forever. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to believe in the power of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Because everyone deserves their own happy ending, no matter how impossible it might seem.